The year is 1720, and London stands as the restless heart of a kingdom that has stretched its reach across oceans. The reign of King George I is in its 6th year, and the city hums with both ambition and unease. It is a year marked by fevered speculation. Talk of the South Sea Company fills the coffee houses, of fortunes made and lost almost overnight. The great plague of decades past is still within living memory, yet the streets teem with more souls than ever, their number swelled by traders, sailors, craftsmen, and labourers from every corner of Britain and beyond. The river is London's lifeblood, carrying in goods from the Indies, the Americas, and the far coasts of Africa. Along its banks the air is thick with the mingled scents of spices, fish, and the smoke of countless hearths. For the average man of the city, perhaps a joiner, a lighterman, or a porter, the rhythms of life are set by the turning of the seasons and the flow of work from dawn to dark. Wages are modest, food plain, but filling. And the week's small pleasures are found in places like the taverns along the Thames, where ale is cheap enough to ease the tongue, and warmth enough to ease the bones. News travels by word of mouth and by printed sheet, but much of what a man knows comes from the talk overheard in such rooms of the King's Court, of warships being fitted in the docks, of the latest scandal in the Exchange, or of a neighbour's fortune or ruin. Against this backdrop of empire's reach and a common man's daily burdens, the tavern offers a rare space where time slows, where the cold is held at bay, and where the company of others can make the weight of the world feel a little lighter. Evening settles slowly over the river, the last of the daylight thinning into a dusky amber that shimmers upon the rippling Thames. The air is cool, touched with the faint salt of the tide and the heavier breath of the city, coal smoke drifting from chimney pots, the scent of damp timber from moored barges, the far-off tang of tar and rope. Along the embankment, the light from iron-lamped sconces glows against wet cobbles, each puddle catching a trembling reflection of flame. Carters rumble past, their wheels striking hollow against the uneven stones, while a barge hand sings low to himself as he secures his ropes for the night. The tavern stands a little back from the water, squat and broad-shouldered, its oak beams dark with centuries of smoke, the upper windows slightly ajar to spill a warm haze into the cooling street. Faint music drifts through the cracks, fiddle and pipe, mingling with the clink of pewter and the soft rise and fall of many voices. A painted sign swings gently above the door, creaking on its chain in the river breeze, the gilt letters catching the lamplight. The door opens to admit a pair of figures in rough wool coats, their boots carrying the damp in with them, and for a moment the warmth from within rolls out into the night like a welcome exhalation. Then the door closes, and the river's murmurs return, steady and patient, as if it has seen such evenings for longer than memory can reach. Inside, the air is dense with the mingled perfumes of a winter evening's trade, the resinous sweetness of burning pine in the hearth, the deep malted richness of ale drawn fresh from casks, a trace of salt pork roasting somewhere in the back, and the damp wool of coats hung near the door, low ceilings pressed close above, the heavy beams stained near black with centuries of smoke, their surfaces polished smooth by countless brushing shoulders. Light comes in pools from tallow candles set in iron sconces along the walls and from the great hearth at the far end, where an open fire snaps and sighs against the sooted brick. Shadows sway gently across the room as patrons shift, lifting tankards or leaning in to speak, their words softened to a warm murmur by the thickness of the walls. A fiddler stands near the hearth, bow moving in slow, steady arcs, his tune weaving through the air like a thread of old memory, accompanied by the delicate chirrup of a small pipe. Tables are close set, their boards scarred and burnished by years of service, and upon them lie pewter plates, a scattering of crumbs, the occasional small knife left to rest beside a wedge of cheese. Boots scuff against the rushes strewn over the floor, their dry crackle releasing a faint, grassy scent each time a heel shifts. The barmaid moves between tables with practiced ease, her linen apron marked with the day's labours, a strand of hair escaping her kerchief as she sets down fresh drink. From somewhere near the back comes a short burst of laughter, quickly muffled, like the fire's brief flare before it settles back into a slow, even burn. Near the door, a small knot of men stands with their backs to the wall, tankards in hand, their talk pitched low but urgent. The flicker of the candles draws a faint gleam along the brass buttons of their coats and the polished buckles of their shoes. One speaks with a faint West Country burr, another in the clipped tones of the city. Their subject drifts from the rising cost of coal to a half-whispered tale about a merchant on Fish Street who has vanished with debts unpaid. At a nearby table, a pair of bargemen share a loaf of coarse bread, tearing it into pieces to soak in bowls of thick mutton stew, the steam rising in slow, fragrant curls. A serving boy, no more than 12, slips between patrons with a cloth in one hand and an empty jug in the other, collecting the vessels to be filled anew. The air hums with the layered sounds of a busy night, the dull thud of a tankard meeting wood, the rustle of a sleeve as someone leans in to speak, the soft hiss of the hearth when a log shifts and sap spits in the flame. In a shadowed corner, a man in a worn tricorn hat scratches at a scrap of paper by candlelight, pausing now and then to wet the nib of his quill in a small glass of dark ale before bending once more to his work. The room's warmth presses in from all sides, the smell of roasting meat and spilled drink, mingling with the faint mineral scent of the river that clings to coats and hair until the outside world seems distant, no more than a memory waiting beyond the stout oak door. At the far end of the room, the hearth commands quiet attention. Its wide brick arch glows with the steady bee-urn of seasoned oak, the logs collapsing now and then into a bed of embers that pulse like the heart of the place. A great iron pot hangs from a hook over the coals, its lid lifting slightly with each slow bubble of the broth within, releasing a savoury breath of onion, marrow, and pepper. A mottled hound lies curled on the hearthstone, one ear twitching as the fiddler shifts into a livelier tune. Beside the fire, a pair of elderly men sit shoulder to shoulder, their coats patched but well cared for, each with a pipe clenched between weathered teeth. They draw in the smoke with long familiarity, exhaling it in thin, pale streams that twist upward to meet the low ceiling beams. Between them rests a small wooden board upon which lies a scattering of game pieces, worn smooth from decades of play, their current match unfolding at the unhurried pace of men who have nowhere else to be. The glow from the fire bathes their faces in soft gold, illuminating the lines carved there by years of river wind and city toil. From time to time, one will glance toward the bar as the tapster lifts another pewter measure to the cask, the dark ale spilling in a steady arc, froth catching the candlelight before settling into a gentle head. All around, the steady rumble of conversation rises and falls like the tide, the tavern's own current that carries the night along. The bar stretches along one side of the room, a solid wall of oak polished to a deep sheen, where countless hands have rested coins, tankards, and elbows. Behind it, shelves are lined with squat glass bottles and earthenware jugs, their contents catching the candlelight in shades of amber, ruby, and gold. The great casks are set into the wall itself, their round faces dark and slightly damp where the tap has been worked all evening. The tapster moves with a practiced steadiness, his broad hands drawing ale in a long, unbroken stream into each waiting measure. The sound of it is a low, comforting hiss, ending in the soft clap of pewter set down upon wood. Coins change hands, heavy, dull silver shillings and smaller copper halfpennies, their clink sharp against the muted hum of the room. Behind the bar, a small kettle sits upon a trivet near the firebox, steam curling from its spout. The scent of hot punch drifts up, sharp with citrus and the dark sweetness of rum. From time to time, the tapster wipes the edge of the bar with a cloth worn thin at the hem, the motion as much habit as necessity. Above his head on a small hook hangs a bell, untouched tonight, whose rare use marks the closing of the house. For now, the room remains alive, each pour and exchange binding the evening into its slow, deliberate rhythm. At a table near the centre, 4 rivermen sit close together, their shoulders hunched against the press of the crowd, each with a half-full tankard before him. Their faces are ruddy from wind and work, the skin about their eyes creased by years of squinting into spray and sun. Wool caps sit pulled low, and the cuffs of their coats are still faintly damp from the river air. They speak of the day's labour, of barges riding heavy with sugar and tobacco from the Indies, of ropes stiff with frost that bit into the palms, of a near miss with a drifting log that might have stove in a lighter's side had the tide run swifter. One man, older than the rest, leans back and draws a slow breath from a long clay pipe, the ember glowing briefly before he exhales a thin veil of smoke toward the low rafters. His voice is gravelly with age as he recalls a winter when the Thames froze solid enough to hold a frost fair, with tents and stalls set upon the ice. The others listen, nodding between mouthfuls of ale, their boots resting firm upon the rushes that crackle faintly underfoot. The scent of wet wool mingles with the deeper aroma of malt, and the sound of their talk, half lost in the wider murmur of the room, has the rhythm of men whose lives are measured by the turning of the tide and the steady pull of the oar. Near the hearth, the musicians hold their small court. The fiddler, a wiry man with sleeves rolled to the elbow, cradles his instrument close, the worn wood gleaming where decades of hands have polished its curves. His bow moves in long, unhurried strokes, the horsehair whispering against the strings before the note blooms into the warm air. Beside him, the pipe player sits upon a low stool, cheeks gently puffing as he coaxes a thin, clear thread of melody from the reed. The tunes are not hurried. They weave in and out of the conversation, carrying the cadence of old country dances and riverside airs remembered from boyhood. Now and again, the fiddler tilts his head toward the firelight, catching its glow in the soft varnish, while his foot taps lightly against the flagstone to keep time. A few patrons hum under their breath, the music settling over them like a shawl, lending an easy cohesion to the room. Tankards are lifted in rhythm, and somewhere a quiet heel stamps in agreement with the tune. The sound does not demand attention, but those who notice find their talk slowing, the spaces between words shaped by the gentle rise and fall of the music. Even the hound at the hearth sighs and shifts, as though the melody has become part of the night's natural order. Through the narrow space between tables, a serving maid moves with steady grace, balancing a broad wooden trencher upon one hip. Upon it lies a portion of salted herring, its skin glistening in the candlelight, flanked by a heel of coarse bread and a wedge of pale, crumbly cheese. The sharp, briny scent of the fish mingles with the warm tang of yeast rising from the bread, creating a fleeting pocket of aroma that lingers as she passes. Her skirts brush lightly against the rushes, the fabric whispering with each step, and her apron bears the faint traces of the evening's labours, a smear of butter near the hem, a dusting of flour along the fold. She sets the trencher before a merchant in a fine but travel-worn coat, its cuffs faintly frayed, the silver thread dulled with use. He nods in quiet thanks, producing a clasp knife from his pocket to carve a careful slice from the cheese. The maid's eyes sweep the room as she turns, noting an empty measure here, a beckoning hand there, before disappearing toward the bar with the soft swish of linen. Behind her, the merchant begins his meal unhurriedly, the blade tapping gently against the wood, each motion in harmony with the slow, comfortable drift of the tavern's night. At a nearby table, the low thrum of conversation sharpens into something more intent, the talk turning, as it often does these days, to the South Sea Company. 3 men lean close over their ale, voices dropping as though the beams themselves might listen. One, with the ruddy face and ink-stained cuffs of a clerk, speaks quickly of shares climbing higher than any sober mind could reckon, of neighbours who boast of sudden wealth. Another, a cooper by the look of his thick hands and broad frame, narrows his eyes, saying he's seen too many good men lose their coin to schemes spun finer than a spider's web. The third, silent until now, swirls the last inch of his drink and mutters that it is the king's own ministers who have filled the sails of this venture, and that if the wind turns, the whole city will feel the chill. Their words weave in and out of the surrounding noise, the clink of pewter, the scrape of chairs, until a sudden laugh from the next table seems to break their thread. They sit back, each taking a long draught, as if to wash down whatever unease the talk has stirred. The clerk glances toward the door, where the cold night waits, and then back to the comfort of the fire, choosing for now to let the matter drift with the smoke toward the rafters. In a quieter corner, half shadowed by a beam, a solitary patron sits with his tankard cradled between both hands. The candle at his table gutters gently, its flame leaning this way and that in the faint draughts that stir through the room. His coat is plain and serviceable, the cuffs worn shiny where his wrists have rested against workbenches or cart rails, and his hat lies on the bench beside him, brim curled from long use. He gazes into the dark surface of his ale as though it might yield some answer, the noise of the room blurring into a distant murmur. Now and again his eyes lift to the hearth, following the slow collapse of a log into glowing embers before returning to the pewter rim before him. The smells of roasted meat and malt drift past, but he does not stir. Outside, a gust presses faintly at the shutters, the wood giving a muted creak. Inside, the candle flame steadies again, throwing a brief clear light over the lines at the corners of his mouth and the pale glint of the drink. The moment holds still, as if the tavern's currents have passed him by, leaving only the warmth of the air and the soft weight of his own thoughts. In the dimmest corner, where the light from the hearth fades into shadow, a small knot of men hunches over a makeshift gaming board. The table between them is narrow and scarred, its surface barely large enough to hold the leather cup, the scatter of dice, and the handful of coins pushed forward in small wagers. A tallow candle leans in its holder nearby, wax pooling at the base, casting a wavering light that sharpens the lines of concentration on their face. The dice clatter softly across the wood, their tumble swallowed almost at once by the deeper murmur of the room. Now and then a low chuckle or a muttered curse slips out, quickly muffled as the players glance toward the tapster, who watches with the mild disinterest of one who has seen 100 such games pass and fade. The coins are not large, a few pennies, the odd farthing. Yet each round carries a tension out of proportion to its stakes. One man, his tricorn shadowing his eyes, fingers a coin along the edge before letting it fall to join the rest, the metal's dull ring briefly clear in the thick air. A shift of the rushes under a restless boot, a faint whiff of tobacco from a freshly struck pipe, and the game rolls on, as discreet as the current beneath the Thames. At a table nearer the centre, a storyteller holds court, his voice pitched just loud enough to rise above the surrounding murmur without breaking its warmth. He is broad of shoulder, with a cloak draped loosely about him, the folds falling to reveal a waistcoat of deep, faded green. Before him sits a small circle of listeners, apprentices, a pair of off-duty watchmen, and a woman with a basket at her feet, their faces leaning toward the glow of a central candle. His hands move as much as his voice, tracing the curve of a ship's hull or the sweep of a storm cloud, and now and then the candlelight catches the gleam of a brass button as his arm swings wide. He speaks of a voyage down to the Azores, of a sea so calm it mirrored the heavens, and of a sudden squall that tore sails to ribbons in the space of an hour. Each detail is measured, unhurried, allowing the listeners to taste the salt in the air, to hear the strain of rope in the wind. Tankards are lifted without eyes leaving the speaker, and the occasional creak of a bench marks a shift in posture as the tale bends toward its next turn. Around them, the tavern continues in its rhythm, yet here, for a few moments, all else seems to hold aside, as if the story itself has drawn a small island of quiet in the middle of the room. Against the far wall, close to where a narrow stair climbs toward the rooms above, an elderly woman sits with her back straight and her hands busy in the dim light. A length of sailcloth lies across her lap, the coarse weave catching at the needle as she works a careful row of stitches. Her fingers are thin, the knuckles prominent, yet they move with the steady certainty of long practice. A small basket at her feet holds spools of waxed thread, a thimble, and scraps of cloth, some patched from old coats, others fresh from the bolt. She wears a plain wool gown, the colour muted by years of washing, and a kerchief tied neatly at her neck. The faint gleam of spectacles perches low upon her nose, catching the candlelight when she tilts her head. From time to time, she pauses to moisten the thread's end or to stretch her fingers, glancing toward the bar as if expecting the return of whoever left the garment in her care. The scent of lamp oil clings faintly about her, mingling with the sharper tang of the sailcloth, and the soft rasp of the needle through fabric is just audible beneath the broader hum of the tavern. Though no one speaks to her just now, she works within the rhythm of the room, her quiet industry as much a fixture of the place as the beams overhead or the fire on the hearth. The door opens on a draught of cold air, and two strangers step inside, bringing with them the damp scent of the river and the street beyond. Their coats are heavy and travel-stained, the wool darkened at the hems from long exposure to rain and mud. One removes his tricorn, shaking free a trace of moisture, while the other stamps his boots lightly against the threshold before crossing into the glow. Conversation dips just enough for a few heads to turn, eyes measuring the newcomers with the swift, quiet appraisal common to any room of regulars. The taller of the two carries a leather satchel slung across his chest, its flap buckled but worn, the edges softened from much handling. His companion, broader in the shoulder, keeps a gloved hand wrapped loosely around the strap of a small bundle swaddled in oilcloth. They make their way toward an empty table near the wall, boots scuffing on the rushes, the door swinging shut behind them to seal away the night's chill. The tapster glances up from his work, a brief nod passing between him and the taller man, as though some unspoken familiarity lies there. A serving maid moves toward them at once, her steps brisk, the faint creak of her stays marking the turn of her waist as she bends to take their order. Around them, the tavern resumes its pace, yet a subtle thread of curiosity remains, winding quietly through the warm air. By the hearth, the mottled hound stirs, lifting its head from the warmth of the stone to cast a slow, appraising glance toward the newcomers. Its ears twitch to the rhythms of the room, the scrape of chairs, the clink of coin on wood, but linger longer on the sound of the satchel's leather creaking as it's set down. A single low thump of its tail meets the moment when the taller stranger passes close, bringing with him the faint sense of wet wool, river silt, and distant smoke. The animal's eyes, clouded slightly with age, follow the path back to the fire, where it resettles with a small groan, curling its paws beneath its chest. A burst of pipe melody drifts across, and the hound's ear flicks once more before sinking into stillness. In the fire's glow, its coat catches shades of gold and grey, each hair lit as the flames lean forward and then withdraw. A stray ember pops and rolls onto the hearthstone, sending a brief shower of sparks into the air, and the dog's gaze follows their ascent, before blinking slowly, lids half closed in the heavy comfort of heat and familiar sounds. Around it, the tavern breathes in its steady cadence, voices rising and falling like the tide, yet the hound's small watchfulness remains, a quiet sentinel in the amber heart of the night. Beyond the main room, a narrow passage leads toward the rear of the tavern, its flagstones worn to a shallow dip by generations of boots. The air here is warmer still, thick with the mingled scents of roasting meat, fresh bread, and the faint tang of vinegar from a jar of pickled onions set upon a high shelf. From the half-open door of the kitchen comes the muffled clatter of pans, the dull thud of a cleaver meeting a joint, and the hiss of fat-striking hot iron. A boy works the spit, his small hands turning the crank with practiced rhythm, the skewered joint of mutton slowly browning over the embers. His cheeks are flushed from the heat, wisps of hair damp at the temples, and every so often he glances toward the doorway, as if measuring how much longer until the next dish is called for. On a side table, trenchers of coarse bread are laid out beside wedges of cheese, their rinds brushed clean of crumbs, ready to be carried forth. A jug of small beer rests in a shallow tub, of cool water drawn from the pump, beads of condensation collecting on the clay. The room hums with purposeful movement, the kitchen's unseen order contrasting with the loose tidal flow of the tavern beyond. Through the open crack, the glow of the hearth in the main room is just visible, a reminder that all this unseen labor keeps the warmth and fullness of the evening alive. Through the back door, left ajar to let out the heat, the rear yard reveals itself in the thin wash of moonlight. The ground is hard-packed earth, scattered with straw and edged by the dark outlines of stacked barrels, their hoops glinting faintly where a nail catches the light. Against one wall, sacks of flour and dried peas are piled beneath an overhang, each bound with twine and marked in black ink from the wharf. The air is cooler here, carrying the sharper scents of river damp and tar, and from somewhere beyond the yard's gate comes the muted slap of water against timber. A cat moves in the shadows, winding its way between a pair of empty casks before slipping soundlessly toward the kitchen door. Above, the roof lines meet at uneven angles, their tiles slick with a sheen of frost, and the faint breath of chimney smoke curls upward into the night. Somewhere upriver, a distant voice calls, indistinct, perhaps a bargeman securing his craft, the sound carried on the steady draw of the tide. Within the yard, all else is still save for the faint creak of rope from a pulley, where a lantern sways gently, its light catching in brief flashes upon the damp cobbles. The doorway behind spills a ribbon of warm air, mingled with the smell of roasting meat, back out into the cool quiet. The quiet of the yard is broken by the muffled grind of a cart's wheels halting just beyond the gate. A moment later, the latch lifts and a porter steps through, shoulders hunched against the chill, his breath fogging in the lantern glow. He carries a small cask cradled in both arms, the wood darkened with moisture from the night air, iron hoops dull but sound. The faint scent of ale clings to it, mingling with the earthy smell of damp wool from the porter's coat. He moves with care across the uneven ground, boots scuffing softly on straw, and sets the cask down upon a low trestle near the door. From within the tavern, the tapster appears, wiping his hands on a cloth, and the two exchange a few quiet words. The porter, nodding toward the river as if to account for some delay in the delivery, A small pouch changes hands, the muted clink of coin, swallowed by the surrounding stillness. With a short nod of farewell, the porter turns back toward the gate, his shadow lengthening against the yard wall before slipping away entirely. The tapster lifts the cask with a practiced heave, carrying it inside, the door closing behind him to leave the yard once more to the cool breath of the tide and the slow, steady sway of the lantern above. When the tapster returns to the main room with the cask, he finds a pocket of unrest near the center. Two men stand a little too close across a table, their words clipped and sharp, the air between them taut. One gestures toward a pewter measure, the other shakes his head with a short, dismissive laugh that does nothing to soften his expression. The surrounding tables grow quieter, the music faltering as the fiddler's bow hesitates mid-stroke. A few patrons glance sidelong, their faces half hidden behind lifted tankards, while others keep their eyes fixed studiously on the grain of the table before them. The tapster moves with deliberate calm, setting the cask behind the bar and wiping his hands, his gaze flicking once toward the pair. A single low word from the taller man seems to ease the moment. The shorter steps back, straightens his coat, and mutters something that is lost beneath the rustle of movement as the room exhales. The fiddler resumes, the bow gliding into a slow, steady air, and the hum of conversation swells once more, as though the interruption had been no more than a passing draught through the shutters. Yet in the subtle glances exchanged and the faint tightening of shoulders, the echo of the tension lingers, folded quietly back into the fabric of the night. Near the wall, a candle burns low in its brass sconce, the flame wavering with each faint movement of air. A serving maid approaches with a fresh taper, the unlit wick pinched between finger and thumb. She leans close, shielding the dying flame with her other hand, and touches the new wick to the old. For a moment, the two fires mingle. The light swelling before the first guttering flame collapses into a thread of smoke. The brass sconce, polished earlier in the day, catches the renewed glow in soft golden arcs, sending faint reflections into the grain of the oak beam beside it. Beneath the light, the plaster wall is uneven, the surface bearing the small scars of years, a nail hole here, a shallow chip there, each one a quiet record of the tavern's long service. The maid straightens, adjusts the candle in its holder, and smooths her apron with a practiced swipe of her hand before slipping away toward the bar. The fresh flame steadies, casting its circle of light over the nearest table, where the rim of a pewter plate gleams faintly, and the shadow of a raised tankard moves like a slow tide across the wood. The renewed brightness folds seamlessly into the tavern's wider glow, a small but certain act of keeping the night alive. Stepping out into the street, the shift in air is immediate, the warmth and layered sense of the tavern giving way to the crisp breath of the riverfront night. The cobbles are dark with damp, their uneven surfaces catching the thin gleam of lamplight that spills from wall-mounted lanterns and the occasional open doorway. Somewhere upriver, a bell tolls the hour, its sound softened by distance but carried cleanly along the water. The Thames lies just beyond the row of buildings, its slow, heavy current sliding toward the sea. The smell of it is distinct, a mingling of brine, wet rope, and the faint metallic tang of silt. The muffled rhythm of the tavern persists behind the door, reduced now to a warm blur of sound beneath the sharper night noises. The hollow knock of a cartwheel over a loose stone, the quick steps of a boy hurrying past with a parcel under his arm, the rasp of a watchman's staff as it brushes the wall. Above, the moon is half veiled by cloud, its pale light silvering the tops of the chimneys and the faint wisp of smoke still rising from them. A light breeze threads along the street, tugging at the edges of cloaks and carrying with it a hint of far-off wood smoke from the countryside beyond the city's sprawl. Along the street, a few late passers-by move through the lantern glow in brief, shifting silhouettes. A fishmonger pushes a barrow with its cargo covered by a damp cloth, the faint briny smell trailing behind him as he steers toward the river steps. A watchman in a thick wool coat walks his slow patrol, lantern swinging from one gloved hand, its light pooling over the cobbles in small, steady arcs. From an alley mouth, a woman in a hooded cloak emerges, clutching a bundle wrapped in coarse linen. She glances once toward the tavern door before continuing on, her steps quick and measured. Somewhere overhead a shutter closes with a soft wooden knock, the sound carrying down the narrow lane between buildings. The air here is a mingling of the city's many threads. A hint of roasted chestnuts from a brazier farther up the road, the faint, acrid note of coal smoke settling low, and the constant undercurrent of the river's damp breath. Each figure passes and is gone, absorbed back into the night, leaving the street to its patient quiet and the occasional flutter of a loose scrap of paper against the stones. Beyond it all, the Thames moves unseen but near, a weight and presence that shapes every sound and scent along its banks. Just beyond the last row of riverside buildings, the Thames reveals itself, a broad, dark expanse carrying the dim reflections of lanterns and windows along its slow, assured course. The water shifts in muted patterns, each swell catching a fragment of light before folding back into shadow. Along the wharf, the hulls of moored barges rise and fall, almost imperceptibly with the tide, their ropes groaning softly where they strain against wooden bollards. The air here is cooler, touched by the open breadth of the river, and carries with it the mingled scents of tarred rope, wet oak, and the faint residue of fish from the day's unloading. Somewhere downstream, a faint splash breaks the quiet. Perhaps a bucket tipped over a gunwale, or an oar dipping into the current. Above, the clouds thin enough for the moon to press a pale silver across the water's skin, laying a trembling path toward the far bank, where the outlines of warehouses and masts stand black against the sky. The sound of the city feels more distant here, muffled by the river's breadth, replaced by the low, constant murmur of the tide as it works its way seaward, steady and unhurried. From upriver comes the slow approach of a barge, its shape emerging first as a deeper shadow upon the water, then resolving into the long, low hull as it nears. Two oars rise and fall in unison, dipping cleanly into the current, each stroke followed by the soft drip of water from their blades. A lantern hangs from the bow, its flame trembling in the night air, casting a small, golden trail upon the dark surface behind it. The voices of the crew carry faintly across the water. Brief, practical calls, the kind honed by repetition, each one answered without pause. As the barge draws alongside the wharf, the creak of timber and the muted thump of rope against wood join the river's steady murmur. One man steps lightly onto the dock, coil of rope in hand, his boots making a dull, hollow sound upon the planks. The air here is heavy with the smell of wet hemp and the sharper tang of pitch used to seal the hull. Within moments the vessel is made fast, and the crew's voices drop again, the work now a quiet rhythm of rope, hands and breath. The lantern sways gently with each movement, casting fleeting shapes along the water before settling into a steady glow once more. Turning back toward the tavern, its presence is marked first by the warm spill of light across the cobbles, a golden pool that reaches a little way into the dark. The painted sign above the door sways gently on its iron bracket, creaking in the faint breeze, the gilt lettering catching a glimmer from the lantern mounted nearby. Through the thick door, the muffled weave of music, laughter, and the clink of pewter drifts outward in short bursts each time it opens to admit or release a patron. A man in a broad-brimmed hat steps out, drawing his cloak tight as he nods to a pair passing by. Behind him, a barmaid leans briefly in the doorway, exchanging a word with someone inside before retreating, the door closing with a low thud. The scent that escapes is rich with roasted meat, malt, and the faint sweetness of pipe smoke, a welcome contrast to the river's damp chill. The windows above glimmer with candlelight, their glass wavy and imperfect, bending the glow into soft halos. As the night deepens, the tavern's glow seems to hold more firmly against the dark, a steady beacon for those still abroad along the Thames. Re-entering the tavern, the shift is immediate, the cold pressed out by a layered warmth that smells of hearth smoke, ale, and the faint tang of spent tallow. The room has quieted since earlier, voices are lower now, conversations leaning inward, and the music has softened to a slower air. The fiddler plays with eyes half-lidded, his bow moving in an easy, unhurried arc, while the pipe offers only a few gentle notes in reply, like a conversation winding toward its close. Some tables have emptied, their surfaces wiped clean, but for the faint rings left by tankards, while others hold only the last stages of a meal. A heel of bread, a smear of mustard, a discarded bone. The rushes on the floor are more scattered, bearing the marks of many boots, and the shadows cast by the candle sconces stretch longer across the beams. By the hearth, the hound sleeps fully now, chest rising and falling in the firelight. The steady rhythm of the tapster's work remains. A pewter measure filled, a coin taken, a quiet word exchanged, but the pace is unhurried, each act fitting naturally into the slow settling of the night. At a table near the wall, the merchant who earlier received the trencher of salted herring now sits with the remains of his meal neatly arranged before him. The fish is picked clean to the bone, the bread reduced to a few crusts, and the wedge of cheese cut down to a single bite resting on the plate's edge. He dabs his mouth with a folded kerchief, drawn from his coat, then reaches into an inner pocket for a small leather purse. The drawstring whispers as it loosens, and he tips a few coins into his palm, silver and copper together, weighing them briefly before selecting the tapster's due. A serving maid approaches, her tread softened by the rushes, and he slides the coins forward with a polite nod. She sweeps them into her apron pocket, leaving behind a fresh measure of ale, its head settling in a slow, creamy collapse. The merchant lifts the cup, glancing toward the door as if gauging the hour by the ebb and flow of those coming and going. Satisfied, he takes a measured sip, the pewter cooling his fingers, and leans back into the shadowed corner, letting the quiet murmur of the room wash over him like the tide easing against a moored hull. In a bench-lined alcove half hidden from the main floor, a young couple sits close together, their bodies angled inward as if to shelter their words from the rest of the room. The man's coat is of modest cut, but well kept, brushed clean of the evening's damp. The woman wears a dark wool cloak, its hood pushed back to reveal hair neatly bound, and a ribbon that catches a trace of candlelight. Between them rests a shared tankard, their hands brushing lightly as it passes back and forth. Their voices are low, but the cadence carries a warmth distinct from the business and banter elsewhere. A murmur punctuated by small, unguarded smiles. From time to time, the woman's gaze drifts toward the hearth, her face briefly lit in gold before returning to the shadow where the man's eyes meet hers. The alcove's walls hold the heat well, the air scented faintly with the beeswax of the candle on their table and the soft spice of whatever punch was served earlier in the evening. Beyond their small refuge, chairs scrape, a pipe is tamped, and the fiddler shifts in his seat. But here the moment is sealed in a kind of stillness, a pocket of quiet intimacy folded neatly into the broader rhythm of the tavern's night. At the hearth, the fire has settled into a deep, steady glow, the larger logs now reduced to broad banks of ember that pulse with a quiet inner light. The tapster stoops to lay on a fresh split of oak, its pale grain bright against the dark coals. As it meets the heat, a sharp hiss rises, followed by the crisp crackle of sap bursting in tiny sparks. A few leap upward, vanishing into the sooted arch above, leaving behind the faint scent of resin. The added wood shifts the fire's voice, a low, contented roar, filling the space between the softer sounds of the room. Shadows near the hearth grow livelier, dancing along the iron fireback and over the stretched form of the sleeping hound, which shifts only enough to tuck its muzzle against a paw. The warmth radiates outward, caught in the faces of those nearby, softening their features in the flicker. A man at the nearest table holds his hands toward it for a moment, before returning them to the comfort of his cup, as if sealing in the heat. The flames, having taken hold, burn steadily on, a patient heartbeat in the center of the tavern, marking the night's slow passage. The fiddler, having let his bow rest for a time across his knee, now lifts it once more, leaning close to his instrument as though confiding in an old friend. He turns the tuning pegs with small, precise motions, each adjustment sending a faint creak through the strings. A quiet note is drawn out, then another, the tones hanging in the warm air before softening into the background hum of the room. Across from him, the pipe player empties the last of his drink, wipes the reed with a cloth, and tests a breath, a thin, wavering sound that steadies after a moment. Their preparations are unhurried, the work of men accustomed to shaping the pace of an evening rather than chasing it. Around them, a few heads turn in quiet anticipation, but most continue their talk, letting the small sounds weave naturally into the tavern's atmosphere. When the fiddler draws his bow in a long, low note, it feels less an announcement than a gentle gathering of the room's attention, the first stitch in whatever tune will carry them into the deeper hours of the night. The pipe joins in softly, a pair of voices finding each other again after a pause, ready to guide the tavern through its next measure of time. As the hour draws on, the tavern begins to loosen its hold on the night's company. Small groups rise from their benches, cloaks drawn over shoulders, hats set firmly against the damp, quiet farewells pass between neighbors. A clasp of hands, a murmur of good night, before they step into the cool air beyond the door. Each opening lets in a brief gust from the river, dimming the nearest candles and stirring the rushes underfoot. The fiddler's tune flows on, softer now, filling the spaces left by departing voices. Near the bar, a pair of watchmen settle their reckoning, coins sliding across the worn oak before they, too, make their way out, boots sounding a steady beat toward the street. The seats they leave behind are quickly gathered in, tankards stacked by the serving maid with the quiet efficiency of one well versed in the end of an evening. Still, a core of patrons remains, men with no need to rise early, or simply unwilling to leave the fire's glow just yet. And for them the tavern's warmth seems to grow denser, the walls holding the heat as the night deepens outside. Behind the bar, the tapster works with the unhurried precision of routine, wiping the oak surface in long strokes that leave behind the faint sheen of spilled ale and candlelight. Empty measures are gathered into neat clusters, the pewter ringing softly as they touch, then stacked upon the lower shelf. Now and again he glances toward the hearth, gauging how long the current log will last, or toward the door when a draught pushes briefly across the room. A small ledger lies open near his elbow, its pages mottled with years of ink and the occasional dark ring from a tankard set down too hastily. He makes a brief mark with a stub of pencil before returning it to the notch in the counter. The scent of the bar is its own blend. Oak darkened by decades of use, the yeasty tang of ale casks, and the faint spice of citrus peel kept for punch. Coins, warm from the hand, clink into the wooden till with a softened weight, and the lid closes with a dull, familiar thud. Each motion carries the quiet finality of a house edging toward rest, even as the low thrum of conversation keeps the night from quite yielding to silence. In the shadowed recess at the back, a solitary figure remains at his table, the dregs of a dark ale resting in the curve of his tankard. His coat is buttoned to the throat, one gloved hand curled loosely around the handle, the other resting on the table beside a small, unopened letter. The wax seal catches a glint of candlelight, its edges worn as though turned over more than once during the evening. He lifts the drink slowly, draining the last mouthful before setting the vessel down with care, the sound barely audible against the room's hush. Around him, chairs are tucked in, stray crumbs brushed away, and the space begins to feel less like a gathering and more like a place waiting to sleep. He does not move to leave, only sits with eyes half lowered, listening to the muffled interplay of fiddle and pipe, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the serving maid makes her rounds. The letter remains untouched, a quiet presence between him and the fading night, its weight as much a part of the moment as the warmth lingering in the pewter before him. The hearth burns low now, the fresh oak from earlier reduced to a lattice of glowing embers threaded with fine ash. The hound, roused briefly by a shifting log, stretches out to its full length, forepaws extended, claws scraping softly against the stone before it resettles with a slow sigh. The rushes near the fire are stirred by the last few footsteps of the night, their dry rustle blending with the faint hiss of settling coals. Shadows climb higher along the beams as the candles burn lower, their flames leaning in the faint draughts that slip through the old walls. A pipe is tapped empty into the hearth, the dottle flaring briefly before fading into the red glow. The room's scents have thickened into a quiet blend. The resin of the fire, the lingering malt from spilt ale, the faint salt of wool drying in the heat. Conversation has dwindled to near silence, words exchanged only in murmurs, as if anything louder might disturb the slow unwinding of the tavern itself. In the heavy warmth, time feels softened, stretched, holding just enough space for the night to breathe before it exhales entirely. One by one, the last patrons make their way to the door, cloaks drawn close and hats pulled low against the river chill. The tapster stands nearby, offering a nod or a brief word as each passes, his hand resting on the worn edge of the oak counter. The final candle on the bar is snuffed with a practiced pinch, a thin curl of smoke winding upward before it disappears into the dim rafters. The hound lifts its head just enough to watch the last figure step out into the night, the heavy door swinging shut with a muffled thud. Beyond the walls, the street lies still under the watch of the half-veiled moon, the distant murmur of the Thames steady against the silence. Inside, the embers settle into a dull red glow, their light flickering faintly across empty tables and the sheen of the polished bar. The air holds the day's warmth a little longer, as if reluctant to release it, and the old timbers seem to creak once in quiet satisfaction. The tavern has given its welcome and spent its cheer. Now it rests, folded into the dark, while the river keeps its patient course toward the waiting sea.